Hello everyone and welcome back to Z Sci-Fi Stories. Unfortunately, YouTube has demonetized our channel, leaving us without an operating budget, but we want to keep bringing you great content. If you enjoy today's story, please consider supporting us with just $1 so we can pay our hardworking staff and keep creating for you. You can support us by scanning the QR code on your screen or by clicking the donation link in the description or the comment section below. The Black Edge was a graveyard of light. It was an expanse of deep space so dark and cold, it felt like a physical weight pressing against the hull of any ship foolish enough to sail its currents. In this suffocating abyss, the Kalan hegemony found exactly what their parasitic empire hungered for: a pristine star cluster brimming with raw, untapped resources. The Kalan were a civilization built entirely on the consumption of others, driven by a relentless ideology of absolute expansion. To them, the universe was not a home, it was merely a banquet, and they had just discovered an untouched feast. Ernie Burdick sat bathed in the dim amber glow of the farthest border outpost, known to humanity. He looked exactly like a man who had long outlived his own era. His faded service jacket was heavily stained with grease and synthetic coolant, his face deeply lined by the harsh radiation of 100 different orbits. He possessed the weary, heavy eyes of a man who had seen too many stars burn out. In his calloused, oil-stained hand rested a heavy, antique silver pocket watch. Its steady, rhythmic ticking was the only sound breaking the oppressive, suffocating silence of the observation deck. He was entirely alone by design. When the Kalan Vanguard fleet finally materialized, it was not announced by grand energy spikes or warnings. It arrived as a silent, crushing wave. Thousands of jagged obsidian vessels ripped violently out of the dark void, casting long, freezing shadows across the tiny human station. They did not broadcast demands for tribute or offer any terms of surrender. They simply opened fire. The defensive shields of the outpost shattered like thin, brittle glass under the sheer, overwhelming force of their kinetic bombardment. Emergency sirens shrieked a warning that came far too late, but Ernie did not run. He did not scramble for an escape pod. He did not even reach for the weapons console to return fire. He merely sat in his worn leather chair, waiting and listening to the heavy metallic thuds of Kalan boarding pods breaching the outer hull. He let them take him without a single struggle. It was exactly where he needed to be. They dragged him roughly onto their command super dreadnought, a massive floating leviathan constructed of dark metal and pulsating biomechanical veins. They threw him into a holding cell that was a sensory deprivation nightmare, explicitly designed to break the mind of a prisoner long before damaging their body. The Kalan interrogators did not use conventional physical instruments. They favored telepathic extractors, which were vile synthetic organisms designed to clamp onto the skull and burrow directly into the deep consciousness of the captive. The guards, towering grotesque creatures of hardened chitin and dense synthetic muscle, activated the extractors, expecting the frail old human to scream. They fully expected his mind to shatter instantly under the crushing psychic pressure. Instead, they found absolutely nothing. When the parasitic extractors plunged deep into the mind of Ernie, they slammed into a wall of pure, freezing silence. There was no terror, no rising panic, no frantic, desperate thoughts of escape. His consciousness felt exactly like a frozen lake, vast, impossibly still, and utterly impenetrable. The cold, telepathic feedback looped violently back into the minds of the Kalan interrogators, sending a sudden shiver of profound unease through their entire local neural network. They were accustomed to prey that fought back violently, prey that begged for mercy. This human was terrifyingly different. He was entirely too quiet, completely oblivious to the subtle, creeping terror infecting their own interrogation ward. The Kalan High Command proceeded greedily with their primary assimilation protocol. Their long-range sensors had detected massive artificial planets scattered generously throughout the abandoned human territory. These were colossal spheres of refined metal, hiding dormant planetary energy cores. Yet, every single one of these massive constructs was completely devoid of biological life. The hegemony fleet commanders clicked their jagged mandibles in arrogant amusement. They naturally assumed the pathetic humans had detected their unstoppable approach and fled in absolute blind terror, abandoning their greatest engineering marvels in their haste to survive. Without a second moment of hesitation, the Kalan commanders ordered the immediate deployment of the core tethers. Massive energy siphons as thick as mountain ranges were violently launched from the bellies of the dreadnoughts, harpooning deep into the metallic crusts of the abandoned human worlds. The hegemony intended to drain these artificial planets completely dry, using human technology to fuel their own endless war machine. Back in the cold, pitch-black isolation of his holding cell, Ernie felt the deep, subtle vibration of the dreadnought, heavily shifting its internal power distribution. The massive tethers were locked in place. He slowly reached into the torn pocket of his jacket and pulled out the heavy, antique silver watch. The intricate tiny gears moved with absolute flawless precision. He quietly watched the second hand tick forward, a tiny mechanical heartbeat, echoing in the dark belly of an alien beast. He did not smile. His tired ancient eyes simply narrowed in the pitch-black room. "They took the bait," Ernie muttered, his voice a dry, raspy whisper that barely carried over the low hum of the alien ship engines. Phase 1 complete. The Kalan armada poured into the conquered sectors, like a plague of metallic locusts. Billions of predatory vessels blotted out the light of the captured stars, bringing a cold, artificial twilight to the silent human systems. They did not move with the cautious grace of explorers, but with the hungry, chaotic frenzy of scavengers tearing into a fresh, monumental carcass. Spread out before them was a prize far beyond their most arrogant calculations. Thousands of colossal Dyson structures encased burning yellow and blue suns, capturing their limitless solar fury with perfect mathematical precision. Massive orbital rings encircled terrestrial worlds woven from carbon steel, and silicates stretching across the dark void like endless silver ribbons. These constructs were absolute marvels of engineering, dwarfing the aggressive parasitic ships of the hegemony. Yet not a single defensive battery fired upon the invaders. Not a single desperate distress signal was broadcast into the dark. The Kalan ships swarmed over the superstructures, deploying endless legions of workers and heavily armed soldiers to claim the completely empty monuments. To the hegemony, this was the ultimate validation of their aggressive existence. They firmly believed they had terrified a vastly superior architectural species into a cowardly mass exodus, just by showing up on their borders. Deep inside the heavily fortified flagship, the supreme commander of the Kalan Vanguard decided to personally inspect his only prisoner. The commander was a towering, horrifying behemoth of bioengineered armor and lethal efficiency, standing easily twice as tall as the captive human. He stomped heavily into the cold interrogation chamber, exuding a suffocating aura of absolute dominance and predatory confidence. The vile telepathic extractors were instantly withdrawn from Ernie Burdick at a single, sharp gesture from the commander. The old human sat up slowly, rolling his stiff shoulders and casually adjusting his heavily creased jacket. He did not cower. He did not tremble. He did not look like a man in the terrifying presence of a galactic conqueror who had just seized his entire civilization. He looked exactly like a tired old mechanic annoyed by a loud, persistent engine knock that he simply did not want to fix today. The Supreme Commander spoke, his voice a grating mechanical synthesis that translated his violent thoughts into harsh, spoken English. "Your species builds grand monuments to their own profound cowardice," the commander sneered, stepping closer to the frail human to cast a long, heavy shadow over him. "We expected a grueling war of attrition. We expected a futile but entertaining resistance. Instead, we found empty, hollow shells. Your people fled into the deep dark, leaving behind the absolute greatest energy reserves ever recorded in the known galaxy. We are taking it all. You are a weak, pathetic prey race entirely unworthy of the stars you previously occupied. Ernie looked up at the towering alien mass of dark chitin and jagged metal. He casually dug a dirty finger into his ear, scratching a persistent itch before wiping his hand on his greasy, heavily worn pants. His expression was completely devoid of fear, reverence, or even basic respect. When he spoke, his voice carried the dry, flat sarcasm of a man who had zero patience left for theatrical villainous speeches. "You really think you won a prize?" Ernie said, his tone completely flat and entirely unamused. "You think you walked into a nice empty house and found the pantry fully stocked, just waiting for you to eat? Let me give you some free advice, buddy. You aren't plugging into a power source. You are hooking your own life support directly to a bomb." The commander let out a sudden harsh sound that resembled grinding metal, a Kalen expression of absolute pure contempt. He entirely dismissed the grave warning as the desperate rambling of a broken, frail mind trying to salvage some tiny fragment of pride. Turning his massive armored back on the insignificant prisoner, he opened a direct encrypted communication channel to the hegemony homeworld. He ordered the immediate and simultaneous activation of the entire massive energy siphon network across their newly conquered domain. Across thousands of star systems, massive mechanical tethers locked violently into the human Dyson spheres and the sprawling orbital rings. The grand order was given. The Kalen engineers excitedly activated the massive assimilation drives. They forcefully linked the newly harvested energy directly back to the molten core of their distant homeworld, creating an unbroken massive chain of power transmission spanning countless light-years of dark space. The parasitic network engaged with a terrifying, deafening roar that literally shook the very metallic foundations of the human-built structures. On the main bridge of the flagship, the primary tactical screens erupted in a blinding, chaotic array of bioluminescent data. The displays showed energy levels violently spiking past absolutely anything the hegemony had ever recorded in their 10,000-year history. Billions of light-years away, the Kalen homeworld, a dark, polluted sphere of endless, brutal industry and endless consumption, received the first massive surge of human-generated power. The skies of their capital planet burned with a brilliant artificial dawn as the stolen energy flooded their ancient depleted grids. The sudden influx of raw stellar power was truly astronomical. Across the entire Kalen Empire, spanning thousands of subjugated worlds, a collective massive wave of pure euphoria swept through their linked neural networks. They threw grand celebrations in their dark cities, believing they had finally ascended to the absolute pinnacle of cosmic evolution. They felt truly invincible. They believed they had stolen the boundless fire of the gods, without shedding a single drop of their own blood, securing their eternal dominance over the galaxy. But amidst the roaring engines and the blinding tactical displays, a deeply chilling reality remained completely unnoticed by the arrogant conquerors. The human territory was entirely too quiet. There were no derelict escape pods drifting dead in the freezing void. There were no hasty makeshift barricades, no dropped hand tools, no signs of a panicked sudden evacuation. The metallic corridors of the massive orbital rings were spotlessly pristine, devoid of any biological residue or the slightest wear and tear. Furthermore, the massive connection ports on the human superstructures were inexplicably perfectly matched to the crude Kalen energy tethers. It was a complete mathematical and statistical impossibility for two entirely separate evolutionary paths to design identical mechanical interfaces. The jagged parasitic harpoons locked tightly into the sleek human reactors, without forcing a single structural breach, exactly as if the human sockets had been custom engineered over long centuries, specifically to accommodate the Kalen technology. The invading empire was so profoundly blinded by their own ravenous ancient greed that they completely failed to realize they had not invaded an abandoned home. They had perfectly and willingly fitted themselves into a bespoke, flawlessly designed mathematical trap. The euphoria on the Kalan homeworld was incredibly short-lived. The grand celebrations choking the heavily polluted streets of their immense capital abruptly ceased when the deep night sky began to simply erase itself. The Kalan lacked any biological concept of supernatural terror, but what they witnessed defied all known cosmic laws and plunged them into absolute primal panic. The ancient constellations, the guiding lights of their 10,000-year empire, did not fade or explode in glorious supernovas. They simply ceased to exist. One by one, entire galaxies were snuffed out, leaving behind a suffocating featureless void, completely devoid of even the faintest background radiation. It was exactly as if a massive invisible hand was wiping a cosmic chalkboard entirely clean. A profound existential dread heavily settled over the billions of citizens. The physical universe they had ruthlessly conquered was vanishing right before their numerous complex eyes, leaving them completely isolated in an ocean of absolute nothingness. Deep beneath the planetary crust, the massive industrial energy grids that had eagerly swallowed the stolen human power began to violently scream. The colossal flow of absolute energy suddenly and violently reversed its current. Instead of drawing limitless raw power from the distant human artificial worlds, the massive tethers became heavily infected conduits. A malicious, impossible force flooded rapidly back into the Kalan systems. It was not plasma or electricity or any known physical energy. It was pure aggressive mathematics. The reversed current began to forcefully rewrite the fundamental quantum structure of everything it touched. Massive alloy support pillars, holding up their subterranean cities, began to warp and phase shifting rapidly through impossible geometric shapes. Solid metallic matter briefly turned into liquid light, before instantly solidifying into entirely unrecognized alien isotopes. The very air inside their deep command bunkers started to taste sharply of ozone and burning copper as the local laws of thermodynamics began to violently break down. The invincible Kalan war machine was not merely malfunctioning under a heavy load. It was being actively unwritten from the very fabric of reality. A billion light-years away from the panicking homeworld, the creeping, terrifying infection reached the heavily armored command Super Dreadnought. Inside the freezing pitch, black holding cell, the heavy silence was finally broken by a dry, raspy human voice. Ernie Burdick leaned back casually against the cold metallic wall, his ancient, silver pocket watch resting comfortably in his grease-stained palm. He did not look at the heavy, reinforced door. He simply stared up at the dark, unseen ceiling and began to speak with terrifying, casual precision. "Primary navigation thrusters offline in exactly 5 seconds." Ernie stated, his voice completely flat and devoid of any emotion. 4, 3, 2, 1. A heavy, sickening shudder ripped violently through the massive dreadnought as the massive engines died instantly. The sudden violent loss of forward inertia threw the grotesque, towering Kalan guards violently against the narrow corridor walls outside his cell. Secondary life support failing on decks 4 through 9 in exactly 12 seconds. Ernie continued lazily, tracing the sweeping second hand with his dirty thumb. Internal gravity plating in the primary armory, destabilizing in precisely 24 seconds. Every single spoken prediction occurred precisely to the exact millisecond. The massive ship groaned as systems collapsed sequentially. The Kalan guards, staring into his cell through the thick, reinforced glass, felt a new, suffocating wave of deep, biological terror. This frail old human was not guessing. He was not predicting. He was entirely reading a script. He knew the exact mathematical death of their invincible flagship, down to the smallest variable. Absolute panic erupted inside the grand laboratory complex of the Kalan flagship. The highest-ranking scientists and neural specialists scrambled frantically over their rapidly failing bioluminescent consoles, trying desperately to understand the absolute collapse of their physical reality. The massive streams of sensory data pouring in from the conquered human territory suddenly made absolutely no logical sense. The background cosmic radiation of the captured star cluster was entirely artificial, looping perfectly exactly every 16 minutes and 4 seconds without a single quantum deviation. The orbital trajectories of the massive empty human planets were entirely too flawless, lacking the tiny chaotic gravitational pulls of natural celestial bodies. But the absolute most terrifying discovery came when their primary quantum computer attempted to calculate the standard universal constants within the human sector. The calculations returned a completely impossible, terrifying result. The mathematical value of pi perfectly terminated at exactly the 4,000th decimal place. The entire territory they had confidently invaded had absolutely no actual physical density. The horrifying truth crashed down upon the arrogant Kalan intellects like a crushing physical blow. The incredibly rich star cluster, the magnificent Dyson spheres, the endless orbital rings, none of it was real. They had not invaded physical human space. They had aggressively marched their entire Grand Armada into a sandbox dimension. It was an incredibly complex decoy reality, constructed entirely out of pure aggressive mathematics and perfectly simulated physics. It was a digital ghost town masquerading flawlessly as a physical galactic empire. But the trap was infinitely more insidious than a simple holographic illusion. By violently plunging their massive energy tethers directly into the simulated human reactors, the Kalan hegemony had unknowingly created a permanent, unbreakable bridge between the physical universe and the artificial sandbox. They had forcefully hardwired their entire biological civilization into a simulation that was currently collapsing. The violent quantum rewriting spreading rapidly across their distant homeworld was the direct result of their own physical matter, trying to forcefully translate itself into pure mathematical data. They were being violently dragged, kicking and screaming into a completely fake reality. The supreme scientists stared in absolute horrified realization at the central diagnostic display. A simulated dimension of this unimaginable, impossible scale should have instantly collapsed under the sheer immense, paradoxical weight of 1 billion invading physical warships. The simulation required an immense amount of processing power to sustain their presence. There had to be a focal point. There had to be a single localized physical anchor, keeping the incredibly complex mathematical structure stable enough to trap them all. The diagnostic trackers frantically traced the entire stability of the fake universe back to a single, tiny biological signature, sitting quietly in a dark holding cell on their own dreadnought. Ernie Burdick was never a captured prisoner of war. He was the incredibly heavy biological weight holding the door of the trap completely open. He was the living, breathing physical anchor of the entire human sandbox. As long as his old, stubborn heart continued to beat calmly in the center of the alien fleet, the fake universe would hold them all tightly in its crushing mathematical grip. Absolute pandemonium reigned inside the grand obsidian halls of the Kalan High Command. The Supreme Ruling Council, a terrifying assembly of warlords and parasitic bureaucrats who had dictated the fate of millions of star systems for 10,000 years, was completely paralyzed by a profound and unprecedented terror. Massive holographic tactical tables flickered erratically, projecting horrifying real-time data from across their vast empire. They were not losing a conventional military war of attrition. They were actively losing their grip on physical reality. The capital world itself was vibrating at a sickening and impossible frequency. The High Warlords watched in absolute horror as their primary planetary communication spires simply phased out of existence, replaced by a terrifying and empty void. They finally understood the catastrophic scale of their monumental arrogance. They were being violently pulled out of the real universe, dragged kicking and screaming into the mathematical abyss of the human decoy dimension. Desperation drove them to extreme and unthinkable measures. The Grand Matriarch of the Hegemony, her thick, chitinous armor trembling violently, screamed a direct emergency order across the surviving encrypted channels. Her command was absolute and ruthless. They were to immediately sever all energy tethers connecting the invading Vanguard fleet to the artificial human planets. When the heavy mechanical locks refused to disengage, corrupted completely by the reverse flow of mathematical data, the matriarch authorized the immediate self-destruct sequence for over 50,000 frontline dreadnoughts. She was entirely willing to sacrifice billions of her own soldiers in a single moment to amputate the infected fleet and save the rest of the Empire. The execution codes were desperately transmitted across the dying network. Yet, absolutely nothing happened. There were no glorious expanding balls of plasma, no shattering metallic hulls, no silent fiery explosions in the dark void. The desperate Kalan engineers hammered their combat controls in vain. The local laws of quantum physics had already been fundamentally rewritten by the human sandbox. The Kalan warships were no longer entirely physical constructs occupying real space. Their core matter had been forcibly fused with the digital fabric of the artificial dimension. A heavily armed warship cannot blow itself up if its highly volatile explosive payload has been mathematically redefined as an inert string of zeros and ones. The terrifying quantum fusion was already complete. The hegemony was permanently anchored to the simulation, trillions of miles away, deep inside the paralyzed Vanguard flagship. Ernie Burdick decided it was finally time to stretch his old legs. He stood up slowly from the cold floor of his holding cell, casually brushing off his heavily stained jacket. He did not bother looking for a heavy weapon, nor did he attempt to physically smash the thick, reinforced glass of his cage. He simply took a calm and deliberate step forward. As his heavy leather work boot approached the barrier, the physical structure of the dreadnought surrendered completely to his presence. The heavy blast doors did not slide open. They simply ceased to occupy the space in front of him. The solid titanium alloy folded inward, dissolving rapidly into a shimmering cascade of complex geometric shapes before vanishing entirely, carving a perfect and unobstructed pathway for the old engineer. Ernie walked at a slow and leisurely pace down the primary access corridors of the terrifying alien Leviathan. The towering Kalan guards, bred for absolute brutality and unquestioning obedience, could only watch in profound and paralyzing horror. Whenever a heavily armed guard raised a weapon to fire, the heavy rifle would smoothly phase into a harmless and transparent mist. Whenever a thick structural bulkhead threatened to block his path, the architecture of the massive ship would smoothly unravel and rearrange itself to accommodate his exact trajectory. He moved through the highly hostile alien fortress not as a vulnerable prisoner, but as the supreme architect walking confidently through his own highly detailed blueprint. He finally stepped onto the sprawling command bridge. The atmosphere was incredibly suffocating, thick with the sour pheromones of absolute alien panic. The Supreme Commander, the towering armored behemoth who had sneered at him just a few hours ago, was now violently trembling, backed helplessly against his entirely useless tactical console. The commander stared at the frail old human as if looking at an ancient and incomprehensible god of destruction. Ernie did not even blink at the towering monster. He casually raised his left hand, holding up the heavy antique silver pocket watch. With a slow and highly deliberate motion, he twisted the tiny winding knob on the side of the metallic casing. That single tiny mechanical adjustment instantly hijacked the entire unified communication network of the Kalan hegemony. Every single broadcast spire, every secure neural link, and every massive public screen across thousands of conquered planets violently locked onto a single audio and visual feed. The tired and heavily lined face of Ernie Burdick was suddenly projected into the minds and grand cities of trillions of terrified Kalan citizens. He cleared his throat softly, the sound booming like heavy thunder across their dying empire. "We did not run from you," Ernie spoke, his voice completely calm and devoid of any anger or malice, echoing with a chilling and detached authority. "We did not hide in terror. We simply outgrew this violent playground. We ascended to an entirely new evolutionary ladder exactly 6 centuries ago, leaving our fragile physical forms and our heavy industries far behind. What you found out here in the dark was never a grand prize. You simply broke into our abandoned museum, and you carelessly triggered the security system." The exact moment his calm words finished echoing through the doomed empire, the true cosmic horror of the trap fully manifested. Across the sprawling Kalan capital, massive obsidian skyscrapers, sprawling industrial military complexes, and billions of panicked citizens began to lose their physical opacity. Half of the entire Kalan hegemony simply began to turn transparent. There were absolutely no fiery explosions. There was no chaotic bloodshed. There were no grand final battles or heroic last stands. There was only a cold, highly methodical, and completely silent erasure. The tension reached an unbearable and suffocating peak as trillions of predatory beings watched their own hands, their own massive fleets, and their own planets quietly fade away into the absolute mathematical nothingness. Driven to the absolute brink of collective madness by their ongoing silent erasure, the surviving Kalan military apparatus centralized their pure primal desperation into a single, unified, cosmic focal point. The tactical targeting arrays of several million heavy dreadnoughts and planetary siege platforms violently realigned. They ignored their own fading translucent armor and completely disregarded the mathematical collapse of their immediate surroundings. Their highly advanced sensors had traced the absolute route of the dimensional anchor directly to a pristine blue and green sphere suspended quietly in the center of the artificial cluster. It was the simulated duplicate of Earth, the absolute core processor of the entire quantum decoy system. If they could just shatter that primary mainframe, they believed the simulation would break and violently spit them back into the physical universe. With a synchronized command that echoed as a final screaming death rattle across their decaying neural network, they unleashed the absolute maximum yield of their entire combined armadas. Millions of supercharged particle lances, antimatter torpedoes, and searing gamma-ray bursts erupted simultaneously from their vast weapon batteries. The sheer terrifying volume of destructive energy was enough to instantly vaporize several dozen normal star systems. A blinding apocalyptic tidal wave of pure aggressive annihilation raced across the dark void, aimed directly at the heart of the human simulation. On the command bridge of the flagship, the Supreme Commander roared in a final act of savage defiance. But before the blinding flash of the incoming weapons fire could even illuminate the bridge, Ernie Burdick made his final deliberate move. He did not brace for the impact. He smoothly gripped the heavily textured winding crown of his silver pocket watch between his grease-stained thumb and index finger. With a sharp, definitive twist, he pulled the metallic crown outward until it locked with a loud, sharp click. Instantly, the fundamental flow of entropy within the entire sandbox dimension slammed to an absolute halt. Time itself did not merely slow down, it abruptly solidified. Outside the massive viewport, the apocalyptic wave of destructive energy instantly froze in the dead vacuum of space. The colossal beams of superheated plasma and cascading antimatter were trapped mid-flight, suspended beautifully and terrifyingly like highly intricate glass sculptures spanning thousands of miles. The blinding light of the lasers ceased to travel forward, rendering the terrifying beams into solid, glowing pillars of trapped photons. The fiery exhaust trails of the millions of Kalan warships became rigid crystalline structures hanging motionless in the dark. Inside the bridge, the Supreme Commander was perfectly paralyzed, mid-roar, his massive jagged jaws locked open in permanent, silent fury. Even the tiny dust particles floating in the suffocating air were suddenly frozen perfectly in place. Ernie casually stepped around the frozen, towering behemoth and looked out at the suspended cosmic apocalypse. He spoke to the paralyzed alien, though the sound waves only traveled because the local space immediately surrounding his physical body was intentionally spared from the absolute temporal freeze. You fundamentally misunderstood the very nature of a highly advanced species, Ernie said calmly, his voice echoing softly against the perfectly rigid air molecules. You assumed that surviving for 10,000 years made you apex predators. But true evolution does not culminate in the ability to slaughter your enemies. We abandoned the crude, archaic concept of brute force exactly 6 centuries ago. Why would we ever waste our precious time fighting a bloody war when we could simply use space-time architecture to permanently quarantine the threat? As he spoke, the final phase of the grand mathematical trap initiated. The artificial universe began to systematically collapse inward. It did not explode in a fiery supernova. It simply began to fold. The incredibly complex three-dimensional fabric of the simulated space suddenly creased and flattened, compressing violently into a two-dimensional plane. The frozen Kalan armada, the massive captured Dyson spheres, the sprawling planetary rings, and the terrifying frozen laser beams were all instantly flattened into a swirling, impossible geometric fractal of highly compressed data. Then the dimension folded again, compressing from a two-dimensional plane into a single one-dimensional line of pure, condensed mathematical gravity. The entire physical mass of the incredibly vast Kalan hegemony, their grand history, their billions of warships, their conquered worlds, and their collective parasitic consciousness was violently dragged into the collapsing architecture. The cosmic origami continued folding at an exponential, impossible rate, crushing the very concept of distance and scale. Finally, the entire decoy universe violently compacted into an absolute singularity. In the span of exactly 3 seconds, an empire that had brutally ruled the known galaxy for 10,000 years was completely compressed into a single, ultra-dense point of mathematical data absolutely no larger than a single grain of common sand. They did not die, but they were entirely removed from the grand cosmic equation, vanishing without leaving a single, microscopic ripple in the real universe. It was exactly as if their terrifying civilization had never even existed in the grand history of the cosmos. Ernie Burdick stood entirely alone. The massive alien flagship, the grand simulation, and the crushing darkness of the Kalan armada were all completely gone. He was now floating effortlessly within a perfectly blank, infinite expanse of pure, white null space. The absolute silence was deafening. He calmly slid the antique silver pocket watch back into his stained jacket pocket and crossed his arms, waiting patiently. The trap had executed flawlessly, but the ultimate terrifying question remained hanging heavily in the quiet void. The Kalan hegemony had forcibly occupied a massive, sprawling chunk of the real physical galaxy. Now that they had been violently and surgically extracted, what exactly was going to happen to the colossal, terrifying vacuum they had just left behind in the real universe? The tension in the sterile white void reached an absolute breaking point as Ernie waited for the final system command to execute. The instant the singularity swallowed the parasitic empire, a profound and heavy silence fell over the physical galaxy. But nature and the cosmos absolutely abhor a vacuum. The massive expanse of real space, abruptly emptied of its tyrannical occupiers, suddenly and violently tore open. It was not a destructive or chaotic rupture, but a majestic, radiant unfolding, exactly like a colossal lotus blossoming in the deep, pitch-black night. Millions of human warships materialized simultaneously across the entire liberated sector. These were no longer the crude steel and titanium vessels of their ancient, violent past. They were breathtaking biological mechanical entities, woven seamlessly from pure blinding starlight and incredibly dense dark matter. Their sweeping, elegant hulls shimmered with a gentle, pulsating luminescence, casting a warm, golden, and deeply hopeful glow across the long, suffering star systems. They moved with an elegant, silent grace, gliding perfectly and effortlessly into the cosmic void left behind by the vanquished conquerors. The human armada was a truly awe-inspiring sight, spanning millions of miles in perfect geometric formations, a testament to a species that had mastered the very fabric of creation itself. Within the sterile white null space, the system executed its final, absolute command. Ernie Burdick felt a brief, weightless transition, a gentle pulling sensation that bypassed his physical senses entirely. Suddenly, the blinding emptiness was replaced by the warm, amber-lit command deck of the true human flagship, a vessel named the Aegis of Dawn. The air here was perfectly crisp, smelling faintly of ozone and fresh pine forests. A towering figure composed entirely of woven hard light and softly glowing energy approached him, holding out a reverent, translucent hand. Ernie reached into his worn, heavily stained jacket and pulled out the heavy, antique silver pocket watch. It was no longer ticking. Its intricate tiny gears were now completely and permanently silent, functioning as the ultimate physical key to an inescapable quantum prison. He placed it gently into the glowing hand of the ship's avatar. "Initiate the Mercy Protocol," Ernie commanded, his raspy voice echoing softly, but with immense authority through the serene, sprawling bridge. Far away, completely isolated outside the fundamental bounds of the known physical universe, the Kalan hegemony collectively awoke from their terrifying transition. They found their massive fleets, their polluted planets, and their billions of citizens entirely intact, basking under the familiar light of their own captured stars. But they were now trapped permanently inside a perfectly closed, miniature pocket universe. They would continue to live, to build, and to survive. But they would never again possess the ability to breach the boundaries of their solitary confinement. They were eternally quarantined. Humanity had deliberately spared them from the absolute fiery annihilation they so readily inflicted upon countless others, choosing incredible compassion over easy vengeance. Back in the physical galaxy, the radiant human armada smoothly and peacefully absorbed the abandoned infrastructure of the fallen empire. Without firing a single energetic weapon, without shedding a single drop of blood, humanity orchestrated the absolute most peaceful and profound transfer of power in the entire recorded history of the cosmos. Across thousands of heavily subjugated worlds, billions of enslaved beings cautiously emerged from their dark, subterranean labor camps and their highly toxic industrial foundries. They looked up at their heavily polluted skies and saw the terrifying, oppressive Kalan dreadnoughts replaced by magnificent, glowing leviathans of pure light. The human ships hung quietly in the upper atmosphere, like silent, benevolent guardian gods. Gentle, invisible waves of restorative energy washed constantly over the scarred planets, rapidly neutralizing the toxic atmosphere and deeply healing the wounded ecosystems. A collective, breathless awe swept through the freed species. Many fell to their knees, weeping openly as they realized the impossible truth. For the very first time in countless generations, they were no longer hunted prey. The absolute darkest era of the galaxy had simply evaporated overnight, replaced by a radiant, breathtaking dawn of unprecedented cosmic freedom. Standing alone on the massive observation deck of the Aegis of Dawn, Ernie Burdick looked exactly the same as he always did. He was just a rough, tired old engineer wearing a grease-stained jacket, completely out of place among the divine beings of light. Yet he was their most vital anchor. He reached deep into his other pocket, pulled out a thick, slightly crushed cigar, and struck a single wooden match. The small, warm orange flame illuminated his deeply lined face as he took a slow, deep, satisfying draw. He exhaled a thick cloud of aromatic blue smoke, watching it swirl gently against the massive, transparent glass viewport. Outside, the Milky Way burned brighter and more beautifully than it had in 10,000 years, completely free from the heavy, suffocating shadow of the parasites. A quiet, profound relief washed completely over him, softening the hard, weary edges of his tired eyes. He smiled, a genuine and deeply human expression of absolute peace. In that quiet, monumental moment, he had proven to the entire vast cosmos a fundamental and unbreakable truth. The ultimate, absolute power in the universe did not lie in the brutal capacity to destroy your enemies. It resided entirely in the profound ability to surgically remove an ancient evil, to fiercely protect the innocent, and above all else, to retain 100% of your own fundamental humanity in the very process. Thank you so sincerely for staying with us and listening to this incredible journey on Z Sci-Fi Stories today. We would absolutely love to know where in the world you are tuning in from. So please let us know down in the comments below. If you found today's story captivating and want to help us keep this channel alive, we humbly ask for your support. YouTube has unfortunately demonetized our channel, leaving us entirely without the necessary operating budget. If you could help with just $1 single, it would allow us to pay our dedicated, hard-working staff so they can feed their families and continue creating these wonderful, epic stories for you to enjoy. You can easily support us right now by scanning the QR code displayed perfectly on your screen, or by using the donation link provided clearly in the description and pinned in the comments section below. From the absolute bottom of our hearts, thank you for your incredible kindness and for being an essential part of our growing community.